Paul.
Okay, well, thanks, Don, and thanks, John, for the prayer. I think it was a beautiful prayer and certainly perfect for what we're going to reflect on this morning. As you know, the overall theme of this week is how to be good at being human. And yesterday we looked at that uh, by probing the role of happiness in the shape of a good and beautiful life, and offering Jesus's path to happiness through the Beatitudes as really a wonderful way of integrating happiness into being good at being human. And today, as Don mentioned, I want to shift the focus to story, specifically the idea of finding a story that is worth the gift of our lives. Because I think if we're going to become good at being human, that also has to be part of it. You know, what would it mean for us not only to find, but to take to heart, to embrace and to live a story that is worth the gift of our lives? And since we'll be talking about stories today, I thought a perfect way to begin would be by telling a story. This story happened on August 16th, 1969. It was the night before my Uncle Bill, William Wadell Salzer, the night before he died. Well, the night before he died, Uncle Bill threw a party in his basement on Weiser Avenue in Louisville, Kentucky. Uncle Bill loved to play pinochle. So if you were going to get close at all to Uncle Bill, you had to learn how to play pinochle, whether you wanted to do that or not. Well, on this Saturday night, Uncle Bill invited about 12 people to the basement of his home in Louisville for a pinochle tournament. Before the tournament began, like any good host, he fed us. So across one side of his ping pong table, he had all the kinds of food that Uncle Bill loved. So there was a lot of sandwich meat, purple cabbage, lots of Limburger cheese, which was Uncle Bill's favorite. And if you were thirsty, behind that, he had rows of Fall City beer, which at the time was a really popular local beer in Louisville. As we ate on his little record player, which was next to the washing machine, he had a stack of polka music. And I think, I don't know what his intent was, maybe to soothe us while we ate. But anyway, while we ate, we listened to polka music. Well, after the meal, the card playing began, and Uncle Bill announced at the beginning that night that whoever won that night in his basement in Louisville would proceed the next weekend to the National Pinochle Tournament in San Diego, California. Now, of course, none of this was true, but Uncle Bill knew that it made for a better evening, a more exciting evening. Well, he orchestrated everything that night. He constantly changed your partner. So by the end of the evening, everybody had everybody else as their pinochle partner. And you never really knew how you were doing because Uncle Bill kept the score. Well, at the end of the evening, to nobody's surprise, he declared that he had won the tournament that night in Louisville and that he would be going on to San Diego for the national finals the next weekend. But he had gifts for all of us. For the adults, he had a fifth of early times Kentucky bourbon. And for myself, I was 18 at the time, a box of Russell Stover candy. The next night, he came out to our house, and after supper, he got into a wild poker game with my parents and my great aunts and uncles. Uncle Bill never did anything quietly. But when it was time to leave that evening, and he also made a kind of grand exit, I noticed something different. Uncle Bill almost always drove, but that night he asked one of my other great uncles to drive, and Uncle Bill got into the back seat of the car. For whatever reason, as the rest of my family had gone back into the house, I lingered. And just as the car was pulling away, Uncle Bill turned to look at me. And I will never forget the look on his face. It was ghostly looking, stricken looking. Well, less than a few miles away, we got a phone call that Uncle Bill had suffered a heart attack and he had died. Looking back on that night, I always think of Uncle Bill's pinochle party as his last supper. On the night before he died, he gathered family and friends to his basement in Louisville. He fed us. We celebrated. And I think in many ways, Uncle Bill, he had suffered with a bad heart for years. So I'm not saying he knew he was going to die the next evening, but I think he knew that his days were numbered. In many ways, I think he was saying to us that Saturday evening, if my life is about to end, how have I done? What have I made of the life that I have been given? Have I told the story well? But these questions are not just for my Uncle Bill, but rather they are everyone's questions, because sooner or later we ask the same thing. What have we done, or what are we doing with the life that we have been given? What kind of story are we writing with our lives? Has it been a good story, a story worth handing on and remembering? If you think about it, we write our stories every day. Every day you add another page to the story that you are writing with your life. Each year, we have finished another chapter of that story. It seems to me that we want to write the story of our lives in such a way that at the end of our lives, people will be able to say about us, that person really lived. We could all say that about my Uncle Bill. Uncle Bill really lived. He was a simple man who in many ways lived a simple life, but he lived life fully. So don't we want the same declaration to be able to be said about each of us, that you and I really lived? Not that we kind of live, not that we sort of lived, but you and I really lived. Now, to be human is to have a story, to be people with a story, to be people who are living a story. But really, to be human is to be involved with many stories. Some of those stories may come and go, others are ongoing. But at some point, we need to step back and reflect on the different stories of our life, particularly to ask, where are those stories taking us? What are those stories making of us? For Christians, as I said yesterday, I think the whole thrust of the Christian moral life is to see ourselves as people who are called to be faithful to the story of God. So Christians are storytellers. We're called to live the story of God that came first to our ancestors of the faith, the Jewish people, and then was revealed in the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I want to look at that today. But before doing that, I want to spend some time explaining why story or narrative is a fitting way to speak about the moral life, and why thinking about the story that we are writing with our lives is key to becoming good at being human. So how did this turn to story? How did this turn to narrative begin? Well, back in the 1970s, some Christian ethicists, particularly Stanley Hauerwas, began giving a lot of attention to the importance of story and narrative for rightly understanding the moral life. The primary reason was simply because every human life takes the form of a story, really several stories. And we can see this because when people ask you who you are, what do? You answer by beginning to tell a story. We describe who we are, what we are about through stories. Some of those stories we inherit. Other stories we choose. Some stories seem to choose us. For many of us who see ourselves as members of the Passionist family, I suspect we might say it wasn't so much that we chose to be part of that Passionist story, but rather that the story of St. Paul of the Cross somehow chose us. That there was something about the story of Paul of the Cross and his companions that spoke to us, that touched us, that claimed our lives in a deep and lasting way. There are other stories that we deliberately reject, or maybe we reject them not because there's anything wrong with those stories, but we know we can't live every possible story. And there's probably for all of us some stories we wish we had never known. This was especially true for my dad. My dad was born in 1923, and when Dad was about 4 years old, his father left Dad and Dad's mom, my grandmother. So that was in 1927. This was very unusual at that time. Dad only saw his father one more time the rest of his life. Obviously, that was a story that my dad never would have chosen, the story that he wished never had come his way. But nonetheless, it was part of his story that shaped him. For other people, there's stories that they wish they could have lived, but it was never a possibility for them. And sometimes that's because of injustice. There's some people who feel called in a certain direction of their life, but they're never able to answer that call because the door is never open to them. So again, justice is going to be a key role in how we understand a story that is worth the gift of our lives. Probably the most important story we inherit comes from our families. We're born into a story. We're born into a family narrative, a family history. It's not a story that we chose. We didn't choose our parents. We didn't choose our grandparents. Parents. I didn't choose Uncle Bill in my life, although I'm awfully glad. I was tremendously blessed that he was part of my life. We don't choose our siblings. So a family is something like an ongoing story, a story that can be messy, complicated, blessed, beautiful, sometimes painful, sometimes exhilarating, sometimes sad, sometimes joyous. And what we learn in the story of our family, a story that we had no say in, a story that we didn't choose, is that even if we don't choose certain people in our lives, we still have obligations and responsibilities to them. I owe my parents something. I owe my siblings something. I owe my aunts and uncles something. I didn't choose them, but they're part of my story. The same really is true of religious families, of religious communities. Members of the Passionist family really didn't choose one another. Rather, they were given to one another, entrusted to one another, because they were all called to share in the same story, the story of Paul of the Cross. It's interesting, I think, to reflect on that. The community that exists, the bond that exists among all the members of the Passionist family wasn't really chosen. That bond was created because every member of that family was brought together by the same story, the story of St. Paul of the Cross. Where we are born and where we live also makes a difference in the narrative that is our life. Being born in Louisville, Kentucky, like I was in 1951, is not like being born in Texas or California or New York City, much less like being born in Africa, Latin America, Asia, or Australia. When we are born also makes a difference. I grew up during the civil rights movement in Louisville, and one very vivid memory of my story happened in the summer of 1967. There was an open housing ordinance proposed in Louisville that was creating all kinds of tension in the city. Well, one Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1967, my mom really surprised me because she said, Paul, do you want to go downtown and join the march in favor of the open housing resolution in front of the Jefferson County Courthouse? That shocked me. I never thought my mother would ask me to do that, but we did. So we went down to the square in front of the Jefferson County Courthouse, and who do I see there? But about a half a dozen Passionist college seminarians in their black pants, white shirts, and black ties, all marching in favor of open housing. Now, I'll never forget that. That memory was really burned into my story, and it inspired me. I was so impressed to see Passionists, these young men, standing for something that they believed in, living a story that they really thought what mattered, a story of justice and human rights. But also think about what it might be like growing up in a time of war. What would it like to be a child today in Ukraine or in Gaza or in other parts of the Middle East. Both of my parents grew up during the Depression and lived through the Second World War. Those facts permanently shaped who they were, their sense of themselves, and how they saw the world. Or we can think of how racism impacted the stories of Native Americans and Black Americans. Or think of the experience today of so many migrants and refugees who find themselves trapped between countries they must flee and countries that refuse to welcome them. So all this is really telling us that certain pivotal events of our life shape our story. Sometimes people suffer tragedies that redirect their lives. Someone close to them dies and they find themselves drowning in grief, wondering how they will deal with a story that now is permanently altered. Or maybe they find themselves dealing with a sudden and very unexpected illness, and all of a sudden the life that seemed to be held together is falling apart. Or maybe they find a job and then suddenly lose that job and are really anxious about their future. Or maybe the unchosen possibilities of their lives somehow continue to haunt them and make them question the direction of their life. So, what I'm suggesting through all these examples is that our lives are a tapestry of stories. And all those stories not only shape ourselves, but more fundamentally, all those stories give us a self. In other words, it's not that we first have a self or that we first have an identity and then find a story, but rather our self is story formed. Our identity comes from all the different narratives of our lives, the stories we inherit, the stories we choose, the stories that seem to choose us, and also the stories we wish had never come our way. That's why Stanley Hauerwas famously wrote, I am not suggesting just that we require stories to understand who we are, although we certainly do, but rather, Hauerwas says, I am suggesting that the mysterious thing we call a self is best understood exactly as a story. I think that's really a profound insight, that this mysterious thing that we call a self is best understood exactly as a story. So to meet another person is to be introduced to a new story. Now, not only do stories give us our identity, our sense of ourself, but they also create a world for us to inhabit. Whether we're talking about a family, a religious community, or a religious tradition, a profession or a career, or the key friendships of our life, each of these stories create a world for us to enter into and to begin to live. So we're formed and shaped, and we're changed by all the different stories of our life. There's no neutral story. There's no story that for better or worse does not shape us, does not form us, that does not imprint us in some way. So the longer we dwell in a story, the longer we embody the story, the more that affects our understanding of ourselves, what matters to us, the more it affects our attitudes, our values, our perceptions, our view of the world, and our actions. But isn't it true at some point, instead of just passively inhabiting those stories, we become characters in the story, active participants who creatively revise, add to, reshape, and sometimes rewrite a story? That was true with my father. My mom's parents also separated, so they came into their marriage together with definitely with parts of the story that they wish had never happened. But instead of simply passively inhabiting that story, they decided to change it, to revise the story by using an element of the story that they wish had never happened to really confirm in them the commitment not to repeat what their parents had done. One way I would describe my parents' marriage is to say, nobody's leaving. From the day they got married, they knew there would be struggles again. There would be hardships. There would be challenges, as there are in any life, in any relationship. But they entered that marriage having made the decision nobody's leaving. We are not going to repeat what our parents did. We'll find a way to revise our story, to rewrite our story in a more promising way. In some sense, I think St. Paul of the Cross did something similar. St. Paul of the Cross was formed in the story of 18th century Italian Catholicism. But Paul of the Cross did not just passively inhabit that story. St. Paul of the Cross added to that story in a very significant way because he had a key insight. Paul of the Cross came to believe that the passion of Jesus is the most overwhelming work of God's love. So Paul had an insight into the Christian story that he believed needed to be heard, hence the Passionist. So why do the Passionists exist? Why did they begin? Simply because an 18th century Italian Catholic named Paul Donio had an insight that there was an element to the story, namely focusing on the crucified Christ, that needed to be heard. There was a message of that story about God's overwhelming love that needed to be told, hence the Passionists. So a second reason that theologians and philosophers turn to story to understand the moral life is because stories hold our lives together. Stories help us integrate the different experiences, the different stages, the different chapters of our lives, so that we can say, this is who I am. This is what my life is about. It is for this that I am living. Now, if you think about that, those are very important statements to make. As children, we're not able to make them. As adolescents, we're not able to make them. But an adult is someone who's able to say, this is who I am. This is what my life is about. It is for this that I am living. All of this is implied when someone says, I am a Passionist, or I am a Christian, or I am a member of this family, of this community, or I am this person's friend. The different stories of our life give coherence. They give intelligibility to our lives. They give us a sense of purpose, direction, and identity. On the other hand, without a story to give a framework to our lives, it's very difficult to know who we are, or what we're about, or what we stand for. Without a story, our lives quickly become fragmented and scattered. We can even say, without a story to guide us, our lives become little more than a series of disconnected events, leaving us with little sense of who we are, little sense of the world, or how we stand in the world. It's very difficult to sustain any sense of identity and meaning apart from stories that give goals, projects, and purposes worthy of the gift of our lives. In fact, it's especially important that we have stories in our life that let us know that we belong and let us know that we are contributing to something larger than ourselves. That's key to becoming good at being human. We need a story that helps us find our place of belonging. Now, that's a simple phrase, but I think it's so key. If I never find my place of belonging, I can't really put down roots. If I never find my place of belonging, how can I really know where I am, who I stand in relationship with, or what my place is in the world? So to become good at being human, we need to find a story that allows us to know where we belong and also helps us understand that we're contributing to something worth the gift of our lives. Now, a third reason that theologians and philosophers turn to story is because the stories and narratives of our life shape our sense not only of the world, but also our expectations of the future. In other words, they help us understand why why we don't all see things in the same way. Years ago, there was a Protestant theologian, H. Richard Niebuhr, who wrote a little book called The Responsible Self. In that book, H. Richard Niebuhr said that all of our actions are reactions. What he meant by that is that all of our reactions are reactions to the story that we think is being told around us, the story that we have become to know. Our actions are responses, reactions to the story that has been our life. So Niebuhr said one way to understand a person's behavior is to realize that all of us act in light of the past we have known, but also in light of the future we anticipate. So our actions stand in the middle. Our actions look back. They look back to the story of our life, to our experiences, to the past we have known, but they also look forward to the future that we anticipate. So this is why to really know and understand a person, we have to know their story. It's really, I think, easy to misjudge a person or to jump to conclusions about someone if we simply look at their behavior at a single moment. We need to know something about their story. What are they reacting to? What are they expecting? What do they anticipate? And I'll share with you a memorable example that illustrates this point. Many years ago, I was living in St. Louis and I took 2 semesters of German at Washington University in St. Louis. And my teacher was a man named John Bass. Well, I remember him because in the second semester, I did an independent study with him. So John Bass and I would meet once a week. Well, we wouldn't just he wouldn't just ask me to translate German. He would always talk a little bit. And one day, John Bass surprised me, and he said, I am an anarchist." And I said, "Well, no, I didn't know that. I did not know you were an anarchist. I had never met an anarchist in my life, but that got my attention. I thought, what had to happen in the life of John Bass to lead him to reach that conclusion? What was the story that he brought with him from his past? What was the story that he anticipated about the future?" So, how we answer those questions, Niebuhr said, the question, "What shall I do?" or "What is going on?" How we answer them depends on the story that we have come to know. A person who has known a lot of hardships and adversity, a person for whom every day is a question of survival, a person who has suffered because of injustice, someone who has been consistently shut out, overlooked, or forgotten, will answer those questions quite differently from someone who has known love, respect, and affirmation. Someone who has been diminished by cruelty and ridicule will have a much different answer to what is going on than someone who has been lifted up by kindness and affirmation. This doesn't mean that people who are well acquainted with misfortune and sorrow and suffering cannot move beyond them to begin to tell their story another way. But it definitely does mean that their sense of themselves, their sense of the world, their sense of possibility will be colored by the stories they have lived. A beautiful example of this, if you haven't read it, is that there's a book by a Jesuit, Gregory Boyle, named Tattoos on the Heart. It's a stunning example of this point. Gregory Boyle is a Jesuit priest who began, many years ago working with gangs in Los Angeles. And Tattoos of the Heart tells the story of these gang members. And as you hear their story, it's really easy to understand why they are the way they are. Gregory Boyle saw his vocation as trying to direct these young men and women, trying to guide them to a better story. I think this is what Passionists do. People come to members of the Passionist family, to Passionist retreat houses, to Passionist parishes, to Passionist missions, trying to find their way to a better path, to a better story. They see in passionists men and women who can help them make sense of their own stories, make sense of the different narratives of their life, but also to help them find a better story. They're drawn to passionists because they see in people who remember the passion, who take the crucified Christ to heart. They see in people who understand what it means to suffer, to struggle, to know sorrow, but also to find their way to a better path. So if the stories that we live are so central to our lives and key to becoming good at being human, then the story that we ultimately choose makes all the difference. How do we find a story that is truly worth the gift of our lives? Stories offer us accounts of what it means to be human, accounts of what we should aspire to as people and community, accounts of how we should understand happiness, meaning, and success in life. Stories are arguments about life, arguments about what is worth pursuing, arguments about what counts as excellence and fulfillment in life. Now, we know that some stories are worth the gift of our lives, but others clearly are not. This is why we need to ask, I think, from time to time, if I enter this story, where will it take me? If I enter this story, where will it take me? If I live this story, what will it make of me? Because no story is neutral. Every story is going to form us and shape us for better or worse. So we need to find a story that helps us understand what a good human life looks like and how we have to live in order to achieve it. That's essential for becoming good at being human. Now, there are many characteristics of a good story, but this morning I want to focus on four that I think are especially important. First, a good story should teach us to recognize, respect, and respond to the full humanity of all persons, regardless of their social, economic, and cultural background, regardless of their race or ethnicity, regardless of their religion or their lack of it, regardless of their physical or mental abilities, regardless of whether they are near the beginning of their life or near the end of their life. A story worth the gift of our life should teach us to recognize, respect, and respond to the full humanity of all persons without exception. Now, many narratives at work in our world fail to do this. Isn't it true that many narratives recognize the full humanity of some people, but not of others? Many narratives will tell us that this group or that group is truly human and therefore worthy of our respect, therefore worthy of justice, but not everyone is. Many narratives at work in our society today seem to suggest that persons of wealth, persons of possessions, persons of physical beauty and health and celebrity really do matter more than anyone else. Other stories dismiss persons because of their ethnic, racial, cultural, or religious background, or because of their sexual orientation and identity. Some narratives tell us that the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and the weak really do not matter as much as the young, the healthy, the talented, and the productive. Any story that does not teach us how to recognize, respect, and respond to the full humanity of all persons cannot possibly help us become good at being human. We have to take that to heart. Any story that does not allow us to recognize, respect, and respond to the full humanity of all persons is not worth the gift of our life. Why? Because if we live that story, that kind of story will foster cruelty and indifference and harshness towards others. Any story that does not teach us to recognize, respect, and respond to the dignity of persons will only increase suffering in the world. Now, I say that strongly, but the reason is how we act is according to how we see. Vision comes before virtue. How I act towards another person is going to depend on how I see them. If in any way I see them as less than fully human, if any way I see them as some way excluded from the human community, that lack of just moral vision, that lack of a reverent moral vision will be expressed through my actions. In other words, I will become an unjust person who is indifferent to the humanity of others. We cannot afford that. The world cannot afford unjust people who are indifferent to the humanity of others. Second, a good story ought to make genuine community possible by teaching us how to live together at peace. This flows from something that we talked about yesterday. Human beings are created for community. We're created for friendship, for life together. We're created for intimacy because we can only live and flourish and become genuinely human together. We are created for life together. But isn't it true that we regularly find it hard to live together? Whether that's in our families, in our communities, in our friendships, or in the larger society. No matter how hard we try, we suffer breakdowns in love. And when I was growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, there was a great amusement park in the west end of Louisville called Fountain Ferry Park. And I loved Fountain Ferry because there was nothing sanitized about Fountain Ferry Park. It was a kind of a gritty place. But one of the attractions of Fountain Ferry Park was the bumper cars. And the thing about the bumper cars, no matter how hard you try, you couldn't avoid colliding with somebody else. I mean, what the whole purpose of the bumper cars was to guarantee collisions. Well, in many ways, I think the bumper cars are a metaphor for life. No matter how hard we try sometimes, whether it's in our families, our communities, or in our neighborhoods, we collide. We bump up against each other. We bruise one another. We say something that stings. We do something that hurts. So a good story has to help us deal with this reality of our human nature. It has to help us deal with all the things that weaken our relationship with others. Practically, this means a good story should teach us how to deal with and resolve conflict peacefully. Resolving conflict doesn't mean causing further alienation or estrangement, but how do we address conflict peacefully? A good story should teach us how to forgive and to be forgiven. That's absolutely essential for living together well. A good story should help us know how to care for, to be kind, to be present to one another. That's important for having the kind of life together that we need if we are going to become good at being human. Third, a good story must be characterized by justice. By that, I mean a good story should teach us how to live in right relationship with others, not just with other human beings, but also with the whole of creation. That, I think, was the point of Pope Francis's Laudato Si, his encyclical on care for creation, that we not only have to learn how to live in right relationship with other people, but with the rest of the natural world, with other species and creatures. So a good story should help us create the kind of world where all people can flourish and be fulfilled. But that's impossible without just persons and just communities. A good story that's worth the gift of our life should form us into just people and just communities. A just person is someone who lives with others in mind. Now, that's more challenging than it sounds. It's very easy to live in a way that we're forgetful of others, to become habituated in ways of living and thinking where we consistently do not live with others in mind. Well, if that happens, life together is impossible, whether it's in families, communities, or the larger societies. So just people recognize that they have obligations and responsibilities to people. They recognize that the needs of other people have a claim on them. That is why they don't talk just about human rights, but also about human responsibilities. That's a key characteristic of the Catholic social tradition. The Catholic social teaching talks about the importance of human rights, but it always complements that with a call to human responsibility, with the summons to recognize their obligations towards others. It's why just people don't talk about only the individual good, but also the common good. The only way for every individual's good to be fulfilled, to be acknowledged, is if we first commit to the primacy of the common good. Now, I think this third element of justice is so important because so many stories today are driven by ideologies of privilege and exclusion. So many stories encourage us to secure our interest by disregarding the interest of others. So many stories promote self-interest and self-advancement in a way that makes it acceptable for us to ignore the needs and well-being of our sisters and brothers, as well as other creatures. Too many stories make it easy for us to become complacent to the demands of justice. I think that's the danger. It's not likely that many of us will deliberately and intentionally uh, seek ways to live unjustly. The danger is complacency, and complacency can creep in without us even noticing it, without us being aware of it. The only story then that will make us good at being human is a story that teaches us that no one truly flourishes unless all of us flourish together. Nobody can really flourish unless all of us flourish together. About a few years ago, I heard a Nigerian priest in a homily say, "The feast cannot begin until there is room at the table for everyone." That's justice. The feast cannot begin until there is room at the table for everyone. Fourth, a good story should help us be honest about the hardships, sufferings, disappointments, misfortunes, and losses of life, but should also teach us how to deal with those in hope. This matters because no matter how well we plan our lives, things go wrong. I can plan and choose and do everything possible to make my life turn out well, but eventually something goes wrong. Parents disappoint children, and children disappoint parents. The friends we thought we could always count on, we sometimes lose. The people we cannot imagine life without die suddenly and unexpectedly. We make choices and decisions we regret, and choices and decisions that other people will never allow us to forget. So no life is immune to sorrow. No life is a stranger to grief. A story worth the gift of our life teaches us how to move through the sorrow, how to move through the adversity and suffering and losses and grief to hope. Again, I think that's why people are drawn to the Passionists. They see in the Passionist community and in Passionist ministers and ministries, they see in Passionists people who are quite realistic about the hardships and afflictions of the world, the people who know how to help us find our way back to life. So I want to take these kind of overall comments about living the Christian story and begin to apply it to the Christian moral life. So I said at the beginning of this morning, more than anything, I think the Christian moral life is a matter of taking on and being faithful to a story. The story of God that came first to the Jewish people, to the Israelites, and then came in Jesus through Jesus's ministry, teaching, death, and resurrection. Christians are storytellers. Christians are people who commit to telling the story of Jesus as faithfully as they can through their lives. Christians want that story not only to characterize their lives, but they want that story to continue to be told through them. So to be a Christian is to know that Jesus handed his story to us. Jesus entrusted his story to the Christian community, to the church. Our vocation is not only to tell that story faithfully, but our vocation is to allow that story to continue to be told through us. That, I think, is the church, the people who promise through their lives to keep the story of Jesus alive. To do that well, each of us has to find our role in that story. I think really that's our fundamental vocation. What is the role that you are being called to in the story of Jesus, in the story of God that comes to us in Christ? Now, the first Christians believed that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus began a new story that called a person to a new way of life. Some theologians describe this as the great reversal, which suggests that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus was a turning point in the history of the world, a turning point that frees us to live in more hopeful and promising ways. We see this throughout the New Testament, especially in the letters of Paul. In Paul, there's that ongoing theme of something old passing away and something new beginning. To take on the story of Jesus is to die to one way of life in order to take up a newer and much more promising way of life. As Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:17, whoever is in Christ is a new creation. The old things have passed away, new things have come. Paul is saying to tell the story of Jesus is not more of the same. If it's more of the same, why bother? To tell the story of Jesus is not more of the same. As Paul says, if we tell that story, we become part of a new creation. Or as he says in Romans 6:4, to take up the Christian story is to walk in newness of life. I love that metaphor. To live the story of Jesus is to walk in newness of life. That's a story that's worth the gift of our lives. So the first Christians knew that to take up a new story is to take up a new life. They knew that if we change our story, we change our lives. That's how they understood baptism. For the early Christians, you took on this new story, this new way of life at baptism. And the symbol of dying and rising was radically symbolized in baptism. By being immersed, by drowning in the waters of baptism, you died to that old story, and you were risen up, you were raised up in a new story, a life of grace. The baptismal garment symbolized you were being clothed into a new story. The baptismal candle, signifying the light of Christ, indicated that your whole life was being illuminated in a new and different way. So baptism incorporated these early Christians into the community, the church that had promised to make the story of Jesus its own. Now, what are some of the prominent characteristics of this new story? I'll be looking at some of those the rest of the week, but this morning I want to focus on one.
Okay, I'm done.
Especially important for Passionists. That element is that to live the story of Jesus is to live from the power of Easter. Now, why is that key? What I'm suggesting today is that Christianity begins with Easter. Christianity begins with Easter. Why? Because without Easter, there is no story to tell. At least there's no story worth passing on and remembering. Without Easter, the Gospels become tragedies, because take Easter away and death wins. Take Easter away and the cross becomes not a symbol of hope, but defeat. Take Easter away, and the cross becomes not a tree of life, but a tree of absolute desolation and despair. Without Easter, death wins. So the heart of the Easter message is that yes, death may be real, but love is stronger. Death may be real, but love is stronger. Death is real, so are evil. Suffering is real, loss is real, sorrow is real, sadness is real, afflictions are real, failure is real. But the message of the crucified and risen Christ is that none of these finally triumph. Because in the crucified and risen Christ, we encounter a God whose love is stronger than death. That's why we can live in hope. In the crucified and risen Christ, we encounter a God whose love is stronger than death. Every Passionist knows this. That's why Passionists take that fourth vow to keep the memory of the Passion alive in their hearts. Why? Because it galvanizes any member of the Passionist family with hope. We need to be galvanized with hope. And we will be galvanized with hope if we realize that in God, we encounter a God whose love is stronger. In the crucified Christ, we encounter a God whose love is stronger than death. Pope Francis noted that Christ's resurrection is not an event of the past, but rather Christ's resurrection continues to permeate and transform the world. Francis said, where all seems to be dead, signs of the resurrection suddenly spring up. However dark things are, Francis said, goodness always reemerges and spreads. Passionists know this. Where all seems to be dead, signs of the resurrection suddenly spring up. However dark things are, goodness always reemerges and spreads. This is why we can live in hope and joy. The crucified and risen Christ testifies that in God we do not encounter a love that tries its best but ultimately fails. Rather, the crucified and risen Christ tells us, it boldly proclaims, that in God we find a love powerful enough, faithful enough, and resilient enough to bring things to life, not just once, but again and again. Not just once to bring things to life, but again and again. This is why no person and no situation is ever beyond hope. If in God we find a love powerful, faithful, and resilient enough to bring things to life, not just once, but again and again, there's no person, there's no situation that is ever beyond hope. The part of taking on the story of Christ, and part, I think, of living the Passionist story, the story of Paul of the Cross, is realizing that we're called not only to spot signs of the resurrection, wherever they suddenly spring up, but we're also called to help make these signs of the resurrection happen by how we live every day. You and I become good at being human when, through acts of kindness, acts of love, acts of listening, acts of patience, acts of mercy and compassion, acts of justice, when through all those things we make signs of the resurrection happen every day. As Pope Francis wrote, Jesus' resurrection is not an event of the past. It will continue to transform our world when we become good at being human. And when we do that by encouraging, supporting, guiding, and accompanying people who are desperately searching for any sign of the resurrection, any sign of hope in their lives. Now, I think we know there's a lot of people today who may not put it that way, but who deep inside are desperately searching for any sign of the resurrection, any sign of life, any sign of hope. Part of the ministry of any member of the Passionist family is to respond to that need by doing what we can to be a sign of the resurrected Christ for them. But there's more. The resurrection of Jesus affirms that a God who called everything to life at the dawn of creation calls us to life, calls us into being again and again. So when we are struggling, when we are overwhelmed, when we feel life being sucked out of us, or when we think that our life is more death in life than life, the message of the crucified and risen Jesus assures us that anyone or anything that denies us life, that anyone or anything that says to us, do not be, cannot be from God. Anything, any person, any situation, any institution that says to anybody, do not be, that cannot be from God. Because Easter tells us that every human being, as well as all of creation, is loved in and rejoiced by God. To take the story of Jesus to heart is to communicate that truth to every person through our words and to action. It's to let them know that anyone or anything that suggests to them that they should not be is not from God. Now, what would this mean for us? What would it mean to live from the power of the crucified and risen Christ each day? I think fundamentally it would mean to choose life over death each day. That's our fundamental moral call. No matter where I am, no matter whom I'm with, I'm called to choose life over death each day. To live in and from the crucified and risen Christ is not to allow ourselves to be shut up in any tomb for any reason. Because the message of the crucified and risen Christ is that God calls us out of the tomb and back to life. God never calls us to remain in the tomb, to be shut in the tomb. God calls us out of the tomb and back to life. God calls us to be set free of any tomb, whether it's a tomb of anxiety or fear, a tomb of grief, sadness, and desolation, a tomb of bitterness and resentment, a tomb of injustice and oppression, a tomb of cruelty and abuse, a tomb of rejection and exclusion. To live in and from the power of the crucified and risen Christ is to know that God calls us to flee the tomb for life. God calls us to flee all persons and all places that may steal life from us. Now, I want to qualify this in one way. I said that God calls people who are in tombs because of grief or sadness or loss to come out of the tomb. But I think when we're going through periods of profound grief and sorrow and loss, it's perfectly fitting for us to spend time in the tomb. If we're going through periods of grief, sometimes our life can seem like one long Holy Saturday. And for a while, I think that's exactly right. Grief requires that we spend some time in the tomb, that we spend some time experiencing one long Holy Saturday. But we can't stay there. At some point, we have to move beyond grief and back to life. But we need other people to help us do that. I also mentioned that people are called to be freed of tombs of injustice and oppression. But people shut up in tombs because of injustice and oppression often cannot free themselves. In fact, the aim of injustice is to keep certain people, certain groups, permanently enclosed in tombs. So part of justice is doing what we can to free people from those tombs. So what this is saying is not only are we called to draw ourselves out of the tomb and more fully back to life, but we're also called to do that for others. Some people have been shut up in tombs for so long that they've forgotten that there is life outside of the tomb. They've been locked in the tomb for so long that the tomb has become dangerously familiar to them. It's become normal everyday life to them, so much so that they cannot imagine life in any other way. Whether it's being trapped in a destructive relationship, or feeling continually exhausted and overwhelmed. Or maybe it's being stalked by painful memories, or being continually unloved and unnoticed. Maybe it's feeling the despair that comes from too many losses and too many defeats. Whatever it is, these people have to find a way to move from death back to life. This is why any of us who take on the story of Jesus and try to live it faithfully need to ask, who did I raise from the dead today? Who did I, through my love, through my kindness, through my support, through my compassion, who did I raise from the dead today? That, I think, is also what it means to keep the memory of the passion of the crucified Christ alive in our hearts. To do that is to be especially attentive and attuned to all those people who have been enclosed in tombs for way too long, and to help them be raised back to life. Now, this is the mission and the ministry of the church, but it's also the heart, I think, of all Passionist ministries. God needs a people. God needs a community that lives by the power and hope of the crucified and risen Christ, so that all the places where death prevails and evil triumphs, to all the places where dehumanizing forces abound, that all those places can be overcome. The vocation of every Christian and the vocation of every Passionist is to live by the power of the crucified and risen Christ, so that we confront, denounce, and strive to overcome the power of death wherever it thrives, so that there's no place and no person that cannot be healed, liberated, and transformed by the crucified and risen Jesus. That's a story that's worth handing on and remembering. So I want to stop there. I know on the outline, there's a little bit there about magnanimity and pusillanimity. I think if I'm going to be magnanimous, it's a good place to stop. So if we want to talk about that, we can do that later. But really, more than anything, what I was trying to say in my reflection this morning is that if at the end of our life you want people to be able to say about you that that person really lived, I think one way that that'll happen is to take to heart and live the Christian story and the story of the Passionists that we've been sharing today. So thank you again for listening so patiently. And